So this is Samyang's first lens for L mount, and it's the 35-150 f2 to f2.8. Hey Lumix friends, so I know why you're here. You want to know my thoughts on the newly released Samyang AF 35-150 f2 to f2.8 lens from Samyang. Well, I've been very fortunate enough to have tested this lens out for the past couple of weeks. Samyang kindly sent me one in exchange for a review. I know there's going to be a lot of Lumix shooters that are excited for the launch of this lens, especially if you're shooting weddings, events, portrait stuff. Not only is it great for video, but also for photography as well. I recently met up with my friend Amanda, who's a model based in London, just to test this lens out for a quick shoot, and I left it in autofocus human detect the whole time. Didn't try any manual focusing at all, and I just hit record. And she kept moving, and I wanted to see how the lens would perform just on the default settings with some fast-paced movement, and I was not disappointed. I'd heard from other people that have used the E-mount version of this product that there were some issues with autofocus. I didn't experience any of those whatsoever. I was actually really surprised with the autofocus performance. Since the release of version 3.0 of the firmware for the S5 II, I found the autofocus absolutely spot on, and it's definitely on par with brands such as Sony and Canon now. I actually love the way that the focus transition when it's detecting the faces and going from, say, like hands to faces is really nice and smooth and natural, and it almost looks like you're having a focus puller work the focus, so I was really impressed with how it performed. Right now I've got the lens set up in this Sure cage with a hand strap, some rails on the bottom for support, Shinobi monitor by Atomos, and then a V-mount power plate on the side there, which is basically just connecting and powering my camera with a dummy battery, and then a D-tap power adapter again to another dummy battery on the Shinobi. So that V-mount battery can basically power the whole system for probably like 8 or 9 hours without having to recharge. So I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of this lens if you're thinking of picking it up. First of all, let's start with the cons. It's definitely a big lens. It's quite heavy. I would say that if you are using it on a gimbal, you might struggle to balance it. I've only got an RS3 Mini, and it definitely didn't feel comfortable balanced on there, especially when extending it to, say, anything over 85. So I think I would probably need to invest in something like the RS4 or RS4 Pro to have it comfortably on a gimbal. Obviously it is a big lens, it's very, very heavy, but I think that can be forgiven given the image performance and just the flexibility and versatility that you get when you're using this, because you can go from 35 all the way to 150 without having to swap lenses. So you can definitely be a lot quicker if you're shooting things like weddings or events. So even though it is a bit of a beast, I can forgive that based on the versatility. On a personal note, I do have a bit of difficulty turning the zoom ring. It is nice and stiff, which I think most people will appreciate, but I actually have a disability with my hands, more noticeable in my left hand, which means that I struggle with my grip. So actually turning and gripping the zoom ring was a little bit stiff for me, but I think I can probably get around that. If I'm going to be treating this zoom lens like I've got a pack of primes, let's say, I can always stop, put the lens down, put the camera down, and rotate the zoom ring and then carry on shooting from there. But I think most people without any mobility problems will be able to quickly change the zoom focal length without any difficulty. It is nice and stiff in the way that if you turn the camera or the lens upside down, it doesn't automatically extend and droop, so that's really nice. There is also a lock switch on the front of the lens, so you can lock it at 35 in case you're carrying it in your bag or you're worried about it extending it by itself. But I think given the stiffness of it, and that might loosen up over time, you should be okay with it extending by itself. Cons, you know, there isn't a lot of cons. I'm trying to think of the cons. I guess one con could be that it's not a constant aperture. So if you're using, say, a 24-70 f2.8, you know that no matter what focal length you're shooting at, the exposure is going to be exactly the same throughout. With this, obviously, it does change from f2 to f2.8 the further down the focal length you go. And that just means that you need to adjust your ND filter or exposure as you zoom further and further in. So that's just something to bear in mind. I'm actually using a mist filter with a variable ND. So this is a variable ND from K&F Concept which is in thread size of 82mm. So the thread size is 82mm. This is a K&F Concept Nano X series variable ND with black mist built in, and I think that gives a really nice softness to the overall look of the image. And you know, I don't shoot without mist filters now. I think since I added those last year, I love to keep everything nice and soft with a little bit of mist. So yeah, definitely using this filter pretty much all the time on the front of this. I'm trying to think of more cons as to why you wouldn't buy this lens, because it's not actually overly expensive for what you get. Being just over £1,000, I think it's actually good value for money. Trying to think of the cons. I guess one con would be I can't use it on the Ronin 4D because it's not electronically compatible. It does fit on there, which I'm surprised at. I haven't tried balancing it or turning it on because I do think it would probably break the motors even with a counterweight. It's just that big. But when you get an image on the camera, it does work, but there is a message on there that you're not able to calibrate it because it can't recognize a lens profile, and you can't manually calibrate it because it doesn't have hard stops that you could put in to use the focus motor. So I guess it's going to be living on the Lumix camera or Blackmagic, whichever L mount camera you have for now. I don't think it's going to work, but you never know, there might be a future firmware update that will make it compatible. It does come with this nice plastic lens tulip hood, although I don't really use that because it restricts access to variable ND, but it's nice that it comes with it in case you use that for photography. I never take photos, but Samyang did ask me to test it out for some photos, and I was surprised actually. The autofocus, especially with the human eye detect, worked really, really nicely. Probably 95% of my shots were in focus and really, really nice and clear. So yeah, really happy. I think if you are a wedding photographer or an event photographer, then this lens would be a great choice, especially given the price. And if you are going to be carrying it directly onto your camera body without all of this cage and stuff like that, it would be a lot lighter to carry. I may have noticed a little bit of vignetting at 35mm and maybe a little bit of that wobbly, warpy stabilization, but I don't know if that is my camera or if it is the ND filter that's causing that vignetting around the edge. But I only noticed it in a couple of scenes, so it wasn't all the time, so I'm not quite sure, but that's definitely something to be aware of. Even though Samyang did gift me this lens in exchange for sample footage, sample photos, and this review, they did not dictate to me what I was allowed to say for this review, so my opinion is completely unbiased, and there honestly really isn't a lot negative to say about it at this point. On to the pros. First of all, autofocus performance on Lumix S5 II, absolutely spot on, had no problems whatsoever. I was a little bit worried, like I said, people with the E-mount version saying that the autofocus wasn't as good, and I guess I don't know whether that's lens or body dependent, but if you're an S5 shooter, S5 II, F2-2.8 then you're definitely going to have no problems using this lens with the autofocus. It worked absolutely perfectly, just as good as my native Lumix lenses. And what I love as well is that the image quality almost looks like I'm shooting on a prime versus a zoom. Even though I love my 28-70, the image quality sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. You can kind of tell that it's not a prime lens, and I love the full frame prime look, so this lens gives me that. Obviously, when you're using it with a camera with built-in stabilization, it does work really well. It does get a little bit tricky just given the length of focal length over 85mm to keep it steady. I'm quite a shaky person anyway, but the stabilization of the Lumix S5 II did do pretty well. I could have turned the E-stabilization on to standard and high, but I actually kept it turned off on this sample footage just because I wanted to see what it looked like with absolutely no crop whatsoever. So my final thoughts on this lens: if you are a wedding, event or portrait photographer or videographer, I think you should definitely consider picking one of these up. It is a big boy, but its flexibility and versatility are going to be great for most occasions. Its wide, bright aperture means it's going to be no problem in low light, and even though it is heavy, I think it can be forgiven given the amazing image quality that you're going to get in most situations. So if you are, like me, a wedding videographer shooting on Lumix, I think you're probably going to be adding it to your kit bag at some point in the future. Thanks again for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the sample footage. That was all completely handheld. which is a bit of out of my comfort zone, but I was really impressed with how the lens performs. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment if you've got any questions, and hopefully I'll see you next time.